This is part two of 6C. And we've already talked about some civil rights stuff. We've already talked about um, Vietnam and the credibility gap that was created with Nixon's and Lyndon Johnson's essentially lying to the American public. We're going to rewind the clock just a little bit, and we're going to talk about détente. And this is literally a French term that means to thaw. And we're fighting a Cold War. So Nixon had this policy of trying to thaw out the Cold War. So we call it détente. In other words, he wanted to ease the tension between the Soviets and the Americans. And for a long time, the United States assumed that the Soviets and the Chinese, because they're both communist countries, would have been natural allies. And it turns out that the Soviet Chinese and the Soviet communists and the Chinese communists didn't really like each other all that much. So Nixon decides to play them against each other. And Nixon actually went to China. You can see him here. He's on the Great Wall of China. Nixon goes to China, which he was able to do because he had been seen as kind of a Cold War warrior, somebody that couldn't be seen as weak on communism. So he goes to China. People think that this is a big step. When the Soviets see the United States becoming more friendly with China, that makes the Soviets nervous that the US and China will attack the Soviets. So the Soviet Union decides to be more open to American negotiations and communications. And it thaws out that tension between the Cold War. And during the Nixon administration and a bit during the Carter administration, the tensions kind of eased a bit. It de-escalated the Cold War a bit. And Nixon argued that this would help in the long run because now the United States could promote economic relationships between the United States and communist countries. And when countries trade with each other, they tend not to be enemies. And you can see that capitalism is going to worm its way into Soviet culture. You can see up here, this is McDonald's. And if you look above McDonald's, that's the Cyrillic alphabet. This is a McDonald's opened in Moscow in 1990. So in the end, economic relationships with communist countries are going to be a pretty effective tool in trying to dismantle the communist countries. When we'll see that when we get to the 1980s. But Nixon has a number of problems. In addition to the escalation of the war in Cambodia and the problems with the draft and all of the other things that led to the credibility gap, Nixon was also a pretty paranoid guy. Now, he had won the 1968 election pretty handily, and that didn't mean that he didn't think the Democrats were out to get him. So in 1972, in the election, a number of issues arises, and Nixon hired a group of people called the Plumbers because he was worried about leaks from his campaign, secrets getting out. So he called them the Plumbers, so they fixed the leaks. The Plumbers also did a bunch of dirty tricks for him. They would go out and spread propaganda, and they would do other things. And one of the things that they did, the Plumbers decided that they were going to break into the Watergate Hotel, which was the place where the Democratic National Committee, the person that's in the group that's in charge of trying to get the president elected or their candidate elected, they broke into the Watergate Hotel where the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, was, and they tried to steal a bunch of Democratic documents, which of course is illegal. The thing is that the Plumbers didn't really make a lot of good choices here, and they got caught. Now, Nixon didn't directly know about the plan to break into the Watergate Hotel, but when, through a series of events, it became known that the Plumbers, the people that broke into the Watergate, were connected to Nixon. And it turned out that Nixon, when he found out about the break-in and the arrest, had tried to cover up the activity. He tried to use his influence to make sure that this problem went away. And that's not good. And when Nixon was discovered as having done this, he also realized that he had recorded himself talking about the cover-up of the illegal activities. And then he covered that up. It actually went to the Supreme Court, and in U.S. versus Nixon, it was decided that the president of the United States can't just ignore a subpoena, and the president can't just ignore Congress and such. And this scandal becomes huge. And it's not the fact that he broke the law. It's the fact that he covered up the breaking of the law that became such a big deal. And that scandal led Nixon to resign because his own party, the Republicans in Congress, told him that they would impeach him if he didn't resign and that they would vote to convict him of impeachment and remove him from office. So rather than face that, Nixon resigned from office. And all the Watergate does is lead to more distrust between the government and the people. Another thing that happened in 1973, when you kind of put all of this mess together, with especially the pulling out of the soldiers from Vietnam, Congress decided that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that gave the president unlimited use of the American troops was a bad idea. So they wrote a law to overturn the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that they called the War Powers Act. And the idea is that they took the ability to declare war back from the president. And now the president had to get congressional approval in order to use the U.S. troops. And essentially, it was an attempt to limit the executive branch's military authority. Now, there's still some loopholes there, and we're still working on that balance between Congress and the president. But they did try to change that. In the 1976 election, Nixon had already won in 68 and 72. He resigned in 1974. He was replaced by Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was not an entirely popular president. He had a mostly uneventful presidency. There's a couple of things in Helsinki, but the big thing that he was remembered for was that he pardoned Richard Nixon, right, for any crimes that he may have done. This is Gerald Ford right here. He pardoned Richard Nixon, which was a very unpopular move. Said that Nixon wouldn't be held accountable for any illegal actions that he may have done while in office, not even the stuff that they knew about. And that was very unpopular. And in 1976, this guy, Jimmy Carter, is nominated by the Democrats. And Jimmy Carter was a Sunday school teacher. He was a single-term governor from Georgia. He was seen as an outsider. For goodness sakes, he was a peanut farmer. And Jimmy Carter was seen as the moral choice for the presidency after all of the tensions of the 60s and all the scandals of the Nixon administration. So at one point, the Democrats were seen as sort of the party of the Christians here. And that's going to change in the 80s. But that's an interesting little side note. Carter is elected to try to bring peace and stability into that presidential campaign. And Carter, for the greatness that he does after his presidency, he had a lot of struggles while he was president. It's hard to be a good man in power. And Carter does have kind of one success that he hangs his hat on, and that was that for a time he did bring some peace to the Middle East. These people over here, these are the leaders of Israel right here. And this is the leader of Egypt. I believe that's Nasser. And through the Camp David Accords, Jimmy Carter was able to get Israel recognized by Egypt. And in exchange, Egypt got back the Sinai Peninsula from the Israelis, a piece of territory that it wanted back. This was a big deal. Egypt had led two different campaigns against Israel in the Yom Kippur War and in the 6 Days War. That's how they lost the land to begin with. So Israel, which had been rejected and they had been refused to be recognized by all of these Arabic countries, is now recognized by a pretty powerful Arabic country in the Middle East. It does stabilize the hostile relations between Egypt and the Jewish country of Israel for a time being. That said, this guy over here is assassinated because of this Camp David Accord. That doesn't go too well for him. But it does bring some peace and stability. The rest of Carter's administration is kind of, for a better word, meh. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan during his term. His response was to boycott the Olympic Games. He also encouraged the CIA to train and arm Afghani freedom fighters, which is, in a vacuum, fine. Except once the Soviet Union leaves Afghanistan, those Afghanis are going to turn their sights on the United States and use that training and arms against the U.S. And probably the biggest crisis of his administration was centered around this guy. This is the Shah of Iran. Iran in the 1970s had a theocratic revolution. Prior to that, it was run by this guy, an American ally, the Shah of Iran, which just means king. So he's the king of Iran. And the Shah was not very popular in Iran. He gave the United States some sweetheart deals on oil, though, so that helped the United States. And when this theocratic Islamic revolution occurred, they wanted to take the Shah of Iran and put him on trial and execute him. And the Shah ran away. He escaped, he went into exile, and because he was an older man, he was on, I believe, kidney dialysis. He asked to come to the United States for medical treatment. Carter, as a humanitarian, didn't want to turn his back on an ally, allows the Shah of Iran to come to the United States to get that medical treatment. The Iranian government, now a theocratic Islamic Iranian government, called for the Shah to be returned to the country of Iran to be put on trial. Carter refused to send him back, and led by the Ayatollah Khomeini and the other Revolutionary Guard, the Iranian people, the revolutionaries, captured the U.S. Embassy and held the 52 U.S. citizens there hostage for 444 days, a little over a year. This is referred to as the Iranian hostage crisis. Now, here's the hostages here. Carter refused to give the Shah back, so they held the hostages for over a year. There was an attempt by Carter to send a couple of helicopters in with some, I forget if they're Army Rangers or Navy SEALs, but there was an attempt to send in military to extradite these people and get them out. One of the helicopters crashed on the way there because of some bad wind conditions. The other one was forced to turn around. In the New York Times in March of 2023, it was reported that Reagan had secretly negotiated with the Iranians to hold the hostages until the election in 1979, the end of 1979, as a way to hurt Carter. That seems a little problematic, but in the end, what happens is the hostages are released after Reagan is elected and put into office. A couple other things to note about Jimmy Carter, though, he's pretty early on in this idea of trying to develop alternative fuels. Remember, there was an energy crisis throughout the 1970s. That was one of the reasons for stagflation. The United States was too dependent on foreign oil supplies. OPEC had raised the rates 400%, which caused an energy crisis. And you can see here, Jimmy Carter is saying, our decision about energy will test the character of American people and the ability of the president and Congress to govern. This difficult effort will be the moral equivalent of war, except that we will be uniting our efforts to build, not destroy. And what are they going to build? The idea was that they were going to build wind and solar power as alternatives to oil usage for energy. He's early in this idea of developing these alternative fuel sources, something that doesn't really become popular for over 25 years, 3 decades in American history. In the end, though, Carter is unable to really effectively utilize the presidency. Inflation, which was already bad because of stagflation, he wasn't able to get it under control. We tend to give presidents way too much influence in these things. Inflation, depressions, they tend to be out of the president's hands, but we blame the presidents for them. Conversely, we give presidents too much credit when the economy is going really well. So he's unable to control inflation. It's a problem Lyndon Johnson had. It's a problem the Nixon administration had. It's a problem that Gerald Ford had. He had a program called Whip Inflation Now. The United States is going to win. That didn't do anything. But in the 1980 presidential campaign, Ronald Reagan comes in promising to fix inflation and improve the American power image throughout the world. And Americans, embarrassed after the Iranian hostage crisis, suffering now for 10 years on inflation, want somebody to come in and try to fix things. And they're going to turn to Ronald Reagan as a way to try to deal with that.